I've used my city function, or Sci-Fi function, from number 8, city function 8, just before the materials were starting, and have created a single building that I want to manipulate and bake out and do some other cool stuff with it. What I did was just use my seed that I created by manipulating the vector using that random constant number and generating a seed, and then going into my vector transform meta node, modifying the XYZ product in order to fit the shape I liked a little bit better. So what I've also done is started, or what I'm about to do is, what we can do is clip out bottom section, and this would work for an individual building. But if we take a look at the geometry, it looks pretty clean and pretty good. So we could pretty easily use this as a standard terrain. There's no reason to use a procedural for this. If you wanted to increase the quality, you could multiply the number up at the top. So now we have 512 by 512. And this is going to be the result of what happens when we convert it to a standard terrain. I don't think we need that much detail because it is a very simplistic looking function. We could add some extra detail to it if needed, but I think it works pretty well like this because we're going to use some other techniques to improve the look of this. So what we can do is go up to the top in the upper left and from the pull down select standard terrain, and that's going to convert this over. So now we have a very fast rendering standard terrain. So we can see that showing up as a render. And it looks pretty good. Now what we can do with this is, since the symmetrical mode works really well with the standard terrain, we can switch it over to asymmetrical and start to clip out the bottom for a better match. So it lines up a little bit better. So we could use this as an object, and I'm going to go ahead, and I'm using the environment mapping mode, so I'm just going to the atmosphere editor, and I'm going to increase the exposure in order to brighten up the scene a little bit. And we'll go ahead and take a look at this from another angle, where we can see some of the details. So this object by itself, we could texture if we wanted to, use it as is, flip it on its side. Because we really don't need to use the terrain editor anymore, unless we want to create or paint on it, add any extra details, which is definitely a possibility. We could even use the sculpting options as a version 8 to extrude outward in the other dimension, but there is a faster way to do some extra details. And first what I want to do is right click, and we're going to go to Bake to Polygons. And I'm going to move this to basically the highest point, or just under the highest point. It does kind of lock in place. There is a preset amount of polygons that are used automatically. So sometimes between 75% and 100% of the slider, it's going to give you the same result. So if you're within mostly the highest point, it should look okay. So now we have a baked mesh, and there is still that seam on the bottom because those points are not merged together. But what we can do is adjust the smoothing angle, and I'm going to go ahead and bring this down to 22. Click OK, and it's going to recalculate the smoothing. And that doesn't look too bad. Just a very basic mesh. I'm going to go into the material and bring the contrast down to about 5. That'll smooth out the areas overall and kind of disperse the light a little bit better. But what we can also do with this is improve the geometry. Now, I think it's going to look better actually on its side. So I'm just going to scale it down and rotate it. We can look at it from the side. So now we have a nice vertical object with some extrusions, and we could save this out if we wanted to use it within an ecosystem to populate a city. You could generate a variety of buildings this way, and it's pretty straightforward. The polygon amount is 227,000, a little high considering it's not very complex, but that's going to give us an advantage for what I'm about to do next. I'm going to take the ground and manipulate the color so that this object stands out a little better. And we're going to select the object, go into the bump channel, the advanced material editor. I'm going to edit the function, and what we're going to do is set up a displacement. We just want something simple. And I also want to stick to a single axis. The changes I want to make per axis I would like to do, I think are going to work better separately. They do tend to. I'm going to go over to the square stones, connect that to the bump channel. I also want to make sure that the orientation of the object is not manipulating the function. So what we can do is switch the mapping mode in the advanced material editor over to the world standard mode. So we'll go ahead and bring this up to, say, 22, and then I'm going to, so 22 for the scale, and then I'm going to add a filter to that link, and we'll use the same thing we used in the functions earlier for building the main function, which is the smooth clip. We use a contrast of 4 and a brightness of 1. Lower clip -1, upper clip 1 should work fine. And let's just take a look. Okay, so what I want to start by doing is having some vertical strips and also some horizontal strips. So we're going to separate those. We just need to figure out which ones we want to create first. So let's do the horizontal extrusions first. So we need to remove a vector. And what I'm going to do is select 0 for the wavelength for the x and y, and just have the z. And now we're going to see the banding. Now I'm just looking at the bump map just to get an idea of the size. I haven't displaced it yet. We could run this as a displacement map, which will have to be calculated. And I do believe that that displacement is stored in the memory then for individual objects, but it still needs to be calculated every time. Just by looking at the map right now gives me an idea really just of the extrusion height that I have, and I think I'm going to change the depth to 0.5 so it's not extruding so much. And then I think the contrast I'm going to up to 5, and then also increase the scale to, say, 30. And we'll go ahead and take a look at that version of it. And then what we're going to do, if the map looks good in this current render, we're just going to bake the geometry to have it extruded. So it looked like on the top there was a little bit of a problem, and I don't want that to be an issue when it's baked. So first what I'm going to do is -5 for the origin, and then we'll go ahead and I'm just going to render something a little bit smaller because I just want a good idea what it looks like. And it looks like that might be alright. Just trying to stay away from having it's the same issues before with the spiking that would show up on the terrain, the procedural terrain. So just trying to avoid that. So that looks pretty good, and what I'm going to do now is select the object in the baked mesh, right-click, and select Baked Polygons. And the slider doesn't make a difference because it is a mesh with a predefined amount of polygons, and I do not have any quality boosts on. Just to explain that really quick, if we go to the material and take a look at the displacement, there is a quality boost. This will increase the geometry of the object. So if that quality boost is turned up, also in the mesh options there's a dynamic subdivision that could also play a role in the amount of polygons used within the bake. Because I have enough polygons and I don't need to increase the amount, I don't have those options on, and that's why when you move the slider, there's no change. So now when we click OK, it's going to bake the mesh and apply that displacement. So now when we render, and I also want to note that when you do bake a mesh with a displacement map, it will remove the bump channel. So if you do want to have or retain that bump, you'll want to save it out first, because it doesn't just turn off displacement mapping, it removes it entirely. That might be version dependent. In 8.5, which is what I'm using right now, it is definitely removed. In version 7 and 8, and also 7.5, that bump map might be retained. I don't believe this is something you can do in version 5, and in version 6, I think you can apply these transformations, although it is much slower to process. Version 8 and 7.5 much faster, 8.5 even faster for generating displacements. So the render of this took 2 seconds, so very quick. No need to process the displacement if you want to have it be fixed. It does look like, because of where I set the symmetry, and with the displacement going inward, it did subtract from the geometry. So if you run into a problem like this, now granted we've already reached a point where we can't go back, because I've moved the camera and that applies as an undo operation, and I move the camera around a lot to look at things, and those will take up all of my undo operations. So as you're going through this process, it's a good idea to either make a duplicate object and keep it in the scene, or save the scene out at different stages, which is what I usually do. I have a scene saved before I apply the displacement, and then after that there's other versions. That way I can always go back. But the reason why that overlapping is happening is because it's from a subtraction. The noise that was used, and of course I've said this several times during the training, the values and the outputs, -1 to 1. 0 is the medium point and basically represents the normals or the polygons at their current state. If it goes down to -1, it is a subtractive amount. Since the noise we were using went down into the negatives, the square stones, it's subtracted as well as adding to the mesh. Now if you want to prevent that from happening, in this case we're going to add that filter and go back to that smooth clip. Since we were using the smooth clip, it does have a built-in operation for this where we can just set the lower clip to 0. Now granted, this is clipping out the actual function, so it may remove some of the geometry. It looks like that's actually working out okay, but it is of course clipping it. If needed, you can also use the map node, which the default settings will automatically give you an outward displacement. If we go back to displacement mapping, we also have an option to displace outwards only. So you can check that on, and that will make sure that it is not going inward and only going outward. The displacement was applied along the normal, and because of that, it has created interesting overlaps in some of these sections, but a lot of that is caused because the space between the two sides was so close. Those are actually from the other side of the object going through, but they do render okay, and it looks alright, and actually gives you a little more control in some ways, where you can create some pretty interesting meshes. So now if we wanted to create some vertical strips, first we need to take a look at the axis. And it looks like the y-axis is where we're going to want to place some of these strips, basically the same way as we did before, just to make it maybe more interesting. So we're going to go into the square stones, and we can set 0 on the z, 0 on the x, and now we should have this applied to the y. Go ahead and take a look, and then we might need to place it on the z, or I mean on the x, because it might be moving along the y, and it looks like it is. So actually what's happening is, since we're restricting the x, the texture is moving along the y, so it's going to show up on the x-axis. So 1 for the x and 0 for the y. And then we should be able to see our bump. And this is what we could use for displacement. Now I'm going to adjust this. I don't want to use something this large. So let's go ahead and bump it up to 35. And I'm going to increase the contrast of the smooth clip to 8. Make it much stronger. So now we can apply displacement to this. If you want to displace outward only, you can check the option on, or manipulate the node to cut out anything below 0. You can also do this by editing the filter, creating a key point on the left side, and setting the y to 0. This will apply the same action because everything below or what was at -1 is now equal to 0. It's the same way as using the map to restrict it. A lot of different ways to customize these things and apply the exact same effect. So if you run into a problem with one method, there is always typically another method you can use to achieve the effect. So turn on displacement mapping, and I do want it to somewhat go in just to see how it's going to look. If it turns out looking bad, I can undo it before moving the camera around a bunch of times and try it again. We can also set the direction of the displacement. Right now it's going along the normal, so it's going to create an even displacement along the areas that are, say, flat here, or curved around the side, an equal displacement as it moves around. A normal is a polygon, if you're not aware of what that is, and the normal is basically the direction in which the polygon is facing, and that midpoint. If we were to see a bunch of lines coming off the normals, it would point in the direction, just basically staying perpendicular to the polygon. So that is the direction of the normal. So we can modify displacement along the normal, or horizontal only, vertical only, or we could set up a normal map in order to use an image to customize what direction the normal is facing. A normal map basically tells the object where the normal is facing, rather than it just being in the position it is. It will manipulate it so that you can create some pretty interesting effects that way. You can also set up a custom displacement in order to manipulate the XYZ vector manually, which is what I like to do for horizontal and vertical, because you can just hit 0 on the node that is created for that axis, and it works a little better sometimes. Really depends. So let's go ahead and right-click, Bake to Polygons, and see how that displacement looks. Once again, we have that subtraction, so it is going through, but I like the way that looks. I think it creates an interesting object. Around the sides, sometimes it becomes a problem because we're going to have geometry that just doesn't look right. So if needed, we could undo. And it looks like I moved the camera maybe way too much again. And I only keep a few undo operations because some of the changes made can store or take up a lot of memory and take a while to load. But now we have a pretty interesting object. We could extrude it up and then use this, apply a texture to it, and have a nice little sci-fi type building. If we need to manipulate the smoothing angle, we can bring this down to, say, 15. There's a lot of geometry in here, so you can get away with a smaller smoothing amount and still pick up good highlights without creating breaks. So we could continue adding smaller details and making the object more interesting, or to begin with the object and as a procedural, you could add some additional geometry that way, or even manipulate the standard terrain before applying displacements. Or you could just run it without the displacement and slap a normal map on it. And that way you don't need all that geometry. If you do find a point where you're running out of geometry, things are looking blocky, very polygonal, in the displacement mapping you can turn up the quality boost or adjust the smoothing option, and it will add a bit more geometry and sometimes work a little bit better. So now this works well for export. You could export this out to another program. If you're using the integrated version of Xtreme, I've just got standalone open right now, but depending on which program you have it in, the full amount of the mesh should completely show as a proxy object. If you're going to be using that proxy object instead of the export method, which I do a lot because it's just faster because the geometry is already there, you may need to merge the points or sometimes remove some of the triangles depending on the way the mesh turns out. If we go ahead and take a look at the wireframe view, we can see because of the way this was extruded as a terrain, we really don't have a lot of geometry around the sides. And the way I rotated the object and flipped it up differently than its original output gave me more control in creating these displacements because most of the geometry was along this direction. Displacing it on the sides could be problematic because there really is not a lot of geometry there. But you can see all of the different triangles, so those are something that if you were to export, you would want to remove those in whichever program you're sending it to. It's usually a pretty simple operation. A lot of major software applications do have a way to remove those triangles. So that'll reduce polygon count in half and then speed up the model. If you are exporting, you may also need to manipulate the UV map, because the UV map is going to be a projection of the terrain when it was flat. So you're not going to have a good amount of space in the UV for the vertical areas. So you may want to also reconstruct the UV. If we were to save this out as an object for populating an ecosystem, one important thing is to modify the pivot point. If we go to the numeric tab and down to the bottom, what we can do is show the pivot point and now adjust the pivot position. If it's relative, it really depends whether you have relative pivot on or off. So it's either showing as a subtraction from the object center or the current state, or the actual location in which the pivot is in the scene, we'll go ahead and set it to 0. Making sure that the pivot on the bottom is important because it is used to typically place your objects onto the surface which you're creating an ecosystem. If you need to give yourself a little bit of leeway, we could bump that up a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and set it to 1. And now we can save this object. And I'm just going to save it as a view object, and we'll take a look at it on an ecosystem really quick. So right-click, save the object. I don't have any texture maps, so I don't need to incorporate anything. I'm just going to call this Sci-Fi building _1, save it out. We could set up a preview so that we can see what it looks like. Click OK and save that file out. Now because the polygon size is kind of large, it'll take up more space as an object than it did as a terrain. Same thing if we were to save this scene. It's going to require a bigger file size to store the polygons, and does take up more information than the procedural or even standard terrain mode. So I'm going to go ahead and save a version of this as well, and then just add something to the scene where we can create a little bit of an ecosystem. So I'm going to add just a plane. Size that up, or we can go to the numerics tab, select the size, and set the size. You also want to pay attention to the scale of the object, which right now is pretty large in comparison to the scene. So we'll see how that converts over as an ecosystem. Select the plane, and for now I'm just going to take this building and move it off to the side. Edit the material of the plane, add an ecosystem, add object, and I'm just going to browse the file, select my building, populate. So now we can see that not really aligned properly. If we want, we can go to scaling orientation, change the direction of surface completely to vertical, and get rid of the rotation in the scaling orientation tab. That way they will all be facing the same direction. We could also, if we wanted to rotate the object and make sure it is aligned in a certain way, we would need to go into the object itself and either modify the orientation of the pivot point or the object itself, because right now everything is going to be pretty much showing up the same way. So now I can edit the material, go to the density, and reduce that. If you want to set up variable scaling and orientation, we could design functions for that. And even in the same way we designed the functions to create the procedural for the buildings, those can work quite well as density and scaling productions. So if we took the density, set a variable density, edit the function, add in the texture map node, and load in one of those images, and I've got an optimized version. Set this to a object parametric mapping mode, which will take that image map and make sure it's mapped correctly. Also setting the mapping mode to flat vertical. So now we have that as our control. I'm going to go to the building scale, set it to 0.1, and those still might be too large to really show within that image. But you can start to see it conforming to the layout that was created from that baked or rendered image of the procedural noise. It's a little difficult to see what's going on here because of the ambient lighting. So I'll go ahead and make the ambient lighting darker, set it more towards sunlight, and we should be able to see a lot more detail, more geometry. So if you want to design a bunch of buildings using that noise generator, apply displacements or not apply displacements, just use textures, using them as a displacement or as a ecosystem works really well and renders very quickly. What usually takes the longest to render is calculating the procedurals themselves. The objects render fairly quickly. Right now we have 621 million polygons in the scene that rendered in 4 seconds. So the polygon amounts really don't affect the render times. It is the materials that affect the render times, also the lighting in the atmosphere. So if you choose to design a bunch of models, you can mix that also with the procedural type terrain method in order to create a sci-fi city. A lot of ways to combine and gain advantages from the different types of techniques and methods for design within Vue.